Welcome, comrades, to the Special Court on Intergenerational Climate Crimes. My name is Jonas Staal. In my role as clerk, I call this court back in session. And I wish to invite on the stage in the court our advocate and witnesses. The second case that is listed, please. The second case that is listed for today's hearings is the indigo trade, the East India Company and the British Crown, establishing agribusiness, destroying interdependent ecologies. And this court will be presided by Comrade Radha de Souza and Comrade Judges Sharon H. Venne and Ramón Vera-Herrera.
Good afternoon, everyone. We are gathered here now to hear the second case for the day. And the case is the indigo trade, East India Company and the British Crown, establishing agribusiness and looking at interdependent ecologies. Some of you may have heard this introduction in the morning. And to those of you who have done it, my apologies for subjecting you to another round of the same briefing. But there are many of you here who are not there in the morning and who may want to know something about these proceedings. The East India Company was established in December 1600 under a royal charter, and it was wound up in 1858 by the British Crown. Indigo was an important item of trade for the East India Company. So you may ask, why are we looking at indigo trade all over again after all these years, when East India Company has been dead and indigo has been replaced by chemical dyes, and very few really use indigo, except for very elitist textile industry that uses only organic dyes. But these are some of the questions. What is the relevance of the indigo trade and the systems that the British East India Company established today? And that is a question that the witnesses will be addressing today. I want to draw your attention to two documents, and I encourage you to familiarize yourself with them. The first is the Intergenerational Climate Crimes Act 2021, which you will find on page 21 of your program booklet. This special court is established under statutes of the Special Court on Intergenerational Climate Crimes 2025. This is a different statute, and you will find these statutes on page 29 in your program booklet. So there are two pieces of legislation here. We must inform you that you are here as members of the jury. In that role, you are a participant in the work of the special court. You are not a visitor, you are not an observer. We ask that you pay careful attention to what the witnesses say, and at the end of the hearings and the end of their testimonies, you make your decisions on the basis of evidence presented to this court. This is a special court in more sense than one. In this court, humans and non-humans are all valued as different forms of life. In this court, you will see in front of you the indigo plant that is here both as witness and as evidence of what happened to the ancestors of this plant. You also have images of indigo, of cotton, of opium, of sugarcane, various plants that East India Company was very much involved in. And we will hear from the witnesses about the relevance of the systems that were established then for us today. They are also here as witnesses and as evidence. The law that you will follow in making your decisions at the end of the hearing today is the Intergenerational Climate Crimes Act 2021. I emphasize this because you may have heard of the language of climate crimes, of the language of corporate crimes outside in different contexts with different meanings. But here we go by what is stated in the Intergenerational Climate Crimes Act. Section 2 and 3 of the Act provide definitions and the aims of this court, and please refer to those sections when you evaluate the evidence. The special court is required to bring special attention to the intergenerational aspects of climate crimes. That is the special purpose, and that is why there is a special court that can focus only on the intergenerational aspects of climate crimes. And Section 4 of the Special Court statutes sets the tasks for all of us today, the judges as well as the jury. Our task together today will be to determine whether or not the relationships of states and corporations are by design set up to perpetuate crimes against ecologies and communities. Therefore, it is our responsibility and our task to pay careful attention to the relationship of states and corporations as legal artifacts and their institutional designs. I want to draw your attention to those two aspects. If the purpose of social institutions are to facilitate reproduction of the conditions that are necessary for life, if the Act of 2021 aims to build relationships of solidarity between people and between people and other life forms, are the relationships between corporations and states as they exist fit for purpose? You will hear from 3 witnesses. The first witness will testify to the indigo trade and under the East India Company. The second witness will testify to agricultural practices today in other British colonies. And then we have the advocate for the court who will assist the court in interpreting these two evidence and the temporalities that exist between the connectivities and the links between these two periods. So with that, I now ask Comrade Staal to call out the witnesses.
I call upon the first witness, Comrade Ghulam Nadri, an Indian historian teaching in Georgia State University, whose research focuses on colonial political economy in the 18th and 19th century, including the indigo trade. Comrade Nadri, you have 20 minutes for your testimony, and in the last minute you will hear a bell.
Do I have the clicker? Honorable judges, Mr. Clerk, members of the jury, the CICC is putting the British East India Company on trial. And I stand here to litigate the East India Company, the British Raj, which consisted of first 100 years of rule by the East India Company and then followed by the British Crown. So I'm litigating the British Raj for the intergenerational crimes that they committed to the people and the nature of the colony. My charges against the British Raj are these: that the Raj perpetuated intergenerational crimes against people and communities and ecologies, such as, number one, assault on the personal, familial, and social lives of peasants and in colonial Bengal or India. Peasants, they fell in the trap, the debt trap, and they suffered the consequences, which is coercion, violence, exploitation, and so on and so forth. The second charge that I bring against the company Raj or the British Raj is the loss of economic sovereignty or the autonomy of peasants to grow crops of their choice. Once they were in the trap and agreed to produce indigo, they were left with no time to grow other subsistence crops or other grain crops that they wanted to grow, which was even more productive and profitable. The third is that this indigo enterprise led to a destruction of the ecologies. It damaged the ecosystem, it damaged and destroyed the biodiversity of the region forever. So people, even today, they face the consequences. And number four, that the colonial estate was complicit in all of this. Right? So there was a collusion between the East India Company and private European capitalists. And later on, when the British Crown took over, there was this collusion between the British Crown and the capitalists who were invested in the business of indigo. And at the center of all of these was this plant that you see here. It looks kind of dry and pinkish, right? But in a tropical summer, this would be a lush green plant. And the leaves, the green leaves of this plant produced a blue dye that we call indigo. Right? It all began, and that indigo then became the medium for the transmission of wealth from India to Britain throughout the 19th century. And the East India Company, the British Crown, and indigo planters, they were the conduits of that exploitation and transmission of wealth from the colony to Britain. Now, it all began with a series of events that unfolded in the 1750s and 1760s. You may have heard in the morning session about some of it. The first was the East India Company's military victory at the Battle of Plassey in 1757, followed by another military victory at the Battle of Buxar in 1764, followed by the assumption or acquisition of the right to collect revenue, the Diwani right, in 1765. Now, what these events led to or produced was a curious phenomenon, right? Phenomena that a trading company, the East India Company, became a sovereign state at that time. And while there were partisans who celebrated and were happy with the transition that the East India Company had taken over, there were critiques of that transition as well. So one of them wrote this. John Cochrane in 1800, he wrote, "The characters of a merchant and a sovereign are inconsistent with each other and cannot unite but with danger to both. The spirit of trade makes them bad sovereigns, and the spirit of sovereignty makes them bad traders. Now, we can imagine what this transition would mean to the people and to the ecology and the communities of this region. These incidents or these developments raised the British ambition to make the colony profitable for Britain, economically profitable for Britain. And therefore, there was the whole series of events or regulations, legislations to make the colony profitable for Britain. And we can see that evident in some of the writings of the Europeans, how they were responding to this transition. For Britain, the promotion of the indigo industry in Bengal became, I quote, the object of highest importance, end quote. And in 1790, the Privy Council in London even considered the promoting indigo production in Bengal as, I quote, a national object likely in time to afford such a supply of indigo to Great Britain as to render any importation of that article from foreign countries unnecessary, end quote. So for all these reasons, soon by the end of the century, 18th century, 1780s and 90s, Bengal emerges, excuse me, as the largest producer of indigo in the world. Precisely because Bengal was a colony. So the colonial status of Bengal became a factor, and you can see the region was endowed with natural resources. One of the most fertile regions of India. You have plenty of major rivers and estuaries, which all were necessary for the indigo production to flourish. And that is exactly what happened. And if you look at I've tried to quantify what it meant, the industry meant. And you can see here in terms of value, so nearly between 20 and 25 million rupees worth indigo was exported every year in the 19th century, from 1780s to the end of the 19th century. Now, India had produced indigo before, right? Pre-colonial India in the 17th century, you have Bayana and Sarkej. They were global indigo brands in Britain, in other parts of Europe, in Asia and Africa. So what was new in Bengal in the 19th century? And the new thing was that simply the scale. The scale was much larger than ever before. It involved large-scale investment of private European capital. So it was it's a private European enterprise to a large extent. The system, the way it worked, was that peasants were given monetary advances of 2 rupees per bigha of land. And they were, they agreed to produce this plant on their land and then deliver the plant at the end of the season to the factory that they received advances from. The company paid 1 rupee for 6 to 12 bundles of that plant that was delivered. And on an average, a bigha of land produced only 9 bundles. So at the end of the production cycle, peasants were able to raise 1 rupee out of the bigha of indigo that they produced. So they were in debt to 1 rupee every time they signed a contract. So this system survived on or thrived on this kind of debt trap. And peasants, once signed a contract to produce indigo, actually never could repay the amount and could be debt-free. And we have evidence that show how these peasants, the generations after generations, they continued to grow indigo for the planters that their ancestors had borrowed money or taken advances. You can see this is how it worked. The peasants had to produce the crop, they had to harvest it, and then bring it to the factory where it was manufactured and the dye was produced. You can see the peasants at work. They had to, even after harvest, they have to take away clear the land and had to work to prepare for the next cycle of seasons. Now, this became so exploitative, full of coercion, that many Europeans at that time didn't fail to notice that it was not at all profitable for indigo growing peasants. Lord Macaulay, who was earlier mentioned, remarked in a memorandum that many peasants were reduced, and I quote, reduced to a state not far removed from partial slavery. In 1832, the Court of Directors observed that and then again I quote, the greatest of evils of which the ryots, the peasants, complain is the almost utter impracticability of being able to free themselves should they once have the misfortune to receive indigo advances, either by their own free will or compulsion. So once they signed the contract, it was almost impossible for them to get out of that trap. Here is what the Indigo Commission, so I will talk about the Indigo Revolt later, but after the revolt, a commission was set up to inquire what went wrong. And then it submitted its report in 1860. This is what the report says. And I read for the people who cannot read from a distance. Owing to the precariousness of the crop and the inadequacy of the payment, the riot invariably falls into balances, and the person once agreeing to sow bequeaths the obligation to their descendants in the third and fourth generation, and that these descendants are either never able to, or if able, are not allowed to free themselves and families from the debt which their fathers have contracted with the factory. So that's what the commission reported in its report in 1860. You have many others who expressed the same kind of sentiment with regard to the way indigo was produced. Here is Linde writing in 1882, and I read here, I quote, "It is not rare to meet with instances in which whole generations are given over, bound hand and foot, to a factory, the grandson is still vainly striving to adjust the accounts which his miserable sire opened in an unhappy moment." These are some of the examples. If you go to the Indigo report, Commission report, you will find plenty of evidence. The Commission got the testimonies and witnesses of more than 100 peasants and other persons, some of the planters, and they testified before the committee and shared their feelings. So this was one aspect of the crime that the British Raj committed against the people. There were other forms of violences and coercion committed against peasants. And again, the report of the Indigo Commission writes, and I read here, I quote, "It included extorting money from them, such as cutting their bamboos, taking away their thatching grass and produce of their garden, seizing their plows, and carrying away their cattle, etc., etc." So they were subjected to other forms of exploitation other than just producing under compulsion for the planters. There are also witnesses talk about the physical violence committed against them, right? Many times they were imprisoned, they were put in confinements. Many of them died because of the conditions that they were put in. Stung by snakes and so on and so forth. There are many examples where their houses were razed to the ground because they were not able to repay the loan that they had got. So that's one form of violence. The second is about the lack of economic sovereignty, right? And again, many peasants who testified before the Indigo Commission talk about how little time they were left with after working for indigo or growing indigo to work on their own land. They had absolutely no time. And again, we can see here, not this one, I think, sorry. They talk about that once they have agreed to grow indigo, there was no time left for them to work on their other land to produce rice or other subsistence crops which were more profitable than indigo. The enterprise was also damaging the ecology or the ecosystem, as I said in one of my charges. And you can see that large-scale deforestation, depletion of resources, natural resources, destruction of natural habitats. All of these followed once indigo began to be produced on a massive scale. At the end of the 19th century, in 1897, nearly 1.4 million acres of land was under indigo cultivation. So more than 500,000 hectares of land under indigo cultivation. So, and you can see here one example, one indigo farmer, a planter, talks about how he got this grant and then the land was cleared. 60,000 acres of land was cleared of the forest, which is actually Sundarban today in Bengal. That was the product of what these planters did in the 19th century there. There are also references to how peasants considered indigo as injurious to soil, right? So many peasants, they had this idea that growing indigo would exhaust the soil and then you won't be able to produce any other crop once you produce indigo on that for a couple of years. Now, a little bit about the British Raj and how it colluded with indigo planters in Bengal or elsewhere in India. And there I would like to talk about the state's institutions, right? The estate or the colonial estate used its legislative and judicial powers to facilitate the entire indigo enterprise and enable planters to fulfill their economic ambitions. And so, for example, the Regulation 5 that was passed in 1830, it made any violation of contract a punishable offense, a criminal offense. So peasants who failed to fulfill the obligation under any circumstance had to be, or they were liable to criminal prosecution. And that could be fines, that could be imprisonment. So that's one example of how the colonial law facilitated this kind of coercive enterprise. Then you have the Charter Act of 1813 and 1833, again, allowed British capitalists to settle in the colonies, and that also accelerated the pace at which the colonial exploitation would take place in the country. So in the end, what we see is that there is a planter-state nexus that emerged in this period. The peasants resisted this enterprise, and you see that Bengal, the revolt in Bengal in 1859, and then at the end of the First World War, you have peasants who revolted and they participated on a on a larger scale in the independence movement. It sparked a new phase in the international movement. You have Gandhi here, launching his first non-violent resistance movement against it. And to conclude, I would say that many of these structures and vectors and conduits of violence and coercion did not end with decolonization. And they have continued, the structures and the institutions, they have unfortunately continued in post-colonial India and in many other parts of the former colonies or decolonized nations about which we will hear from the other witness. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your testimony. We now move to questions for the witness by the judges for 15 minutes.
You start first?
Thank you very much for your testimony. You were talking very strongly about what happened with peasants that failed to fulfill their obligations. No? And perhaps it would be great if you could detail the methods of subjugation, the methods used to submit people to their tasks, the main punishments and conditions of labor, because we need to depict these conditions in detail. No? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. The regulation that I mentioned, Regulation 5 of 1830, actually was withdrawn a couple of years later. But the peasants, they never came to know that the regulation has been withdrawn. So they continued to be subjected to the same kind of law throughout this period. And the planters, they took advantage of that. The way it worked that, some peasants, especially before 1833, or in the beginning, they willingly signed the contract because they were getting cash advances, and that's how they were lured to get into this business. But later on, there are references, many peasants, they complained that they never signed any contract. So they were just asked to sign on a blank sheet of paper, or in many cases, they even had to do that. It was just that they were given the money and they were bound to fulfill the promises that came with that advance. And that's how they had to do that. Again, if we go to the witnesses that testified to the Indigo Commission, you see that they talk about how they were exploited by the planters who gave them money. Their properties were taken away. In many cases, their houses were pulled to ground. Sometimes even the women were assaulted. They were imprisoned. There are many examples where those planters who failed to fulfill the contracts were put in confinement in the barns, and then later, a couple of days, they were found dead because of snake bite or whatever. So, but it was a challenge for the planters as well, how to recover the loan, the money that they had extended. And that's where these regulations and laws came in, to the point that peasants, they never thought of taking recourse to the court of law, because they knew that the planters, they had influence. In many cases, planters themselves were the magistrates. There was a law in 1757 that allowed planters to become honorary magistrates. So if the planter is also the magistrate, what kind of court it would be, right? So peasants, they were convinced that a legal course is not going to take them anywhere. But the planters, they had their way to recover their money that they initially extended to the family by taking away their cattle, their plows, right at the time when they had to work on their own land to grow rice and other crops. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you want to go or shall I? Okay. I have a question for you, if I may. And that is, can you clarify for the jury members here? You talked about the company Raj, then there is the British Raj, and then there is Britain here in Westminster. And what is the relationship? How are these institutions related? And from what I understood, when you said that the financiers and investors came and invested in indigo cultivation, then the East India Company was the government in India, and the East India Company was also a trading company, and they issued licenses and permissions to financiers to come and invest in indigo and to produce indigo. Is that right? And how do you see, if you can just clarify this, because British Raj, Company Raj, Britain, colonial Britain, it gets a little confusing maybe.
Right, so thank you for the question, Honorable Judge. Well, so the East India Company was a trading company that had been trading in India since the early 1600s, right? What happened in the middle of the 18th century that got involved into the politics and then raised its own military and then fought against the local rulers, defeated them, and colonized Bengal. So from 1757 to 1857, when the company was dissolved, the colony, Bengal, and other parts of India were governed or ruled by the East India Company. So East India Company was a state, was a sovereign state in the colony, right? But then there was a super state, and that was Britain, that the East India Company was accountable to. Right? So, but what we see in general is that the super state, which is Britain, and the East India Company, most of the time they were colluding with each other. So, for example, when the East India Company came up with this Regulation 5, there was a kind of tacit, endorsement from Britain, the superstate, to make it a criminal offense for peasants if they failed to fulfill their obligations. What happened in 1813 and 1833, the charters that I mentioned, the East India Company lost the monopoly, the trade monopoly that it had in Bengal. So when that monopoly was withdrawn, the floodgate was open for any British citizen with capital to go to the colony, invest in land, become a zamindar or a landlord, become an indigo planter, and then make fortunes. So that opened a kind of floodgate where hundreds of them, they flocked to Bengal, established plantations. There was also the rule or the law that these planters, they were given zamindari rights, right? The rights to land, to hold land, to own land and collect revenue, like in earlier times. And they took advantage of that situation where they were not only the rightful holder of lands, but they were also the investors, right? They had a business to conduct. And that combination of business ambition and the political power contributed to the situation where we were. And then in 1857, after the first war of India's independence, or the revolt of 1857, the company was dissolved, and then India came into the direct control of Britain. Right? British Crown took over, and then we entered into the British Raj, where the viceroys and other officials, they were appointed by the British state in India, where the regulations and laws, they were created, they were imposed by the estate in Britain. What I see is happening again, and we will hear more from our other speaker later on, is this, that more than the nexus between a state and corporations, what we see here is that the corporations themselves became states, right? And that complicated the whole situation, and that's why we see that such a crime against the communities, against ecologies, were perpetrated for such a long period throughout the 19th and early 20th century. So under both the East India Company's rule and the British Crown Raj, the structures of exploitation, the institutions, the legislative agenda remained the same. And it actually accelerated after the British Crown took it over after 1857. So the law of 1857 actually allowed planters to become magistrates. And one of the slides you may have noticed that a peasant says that he cannot fight against the planter because planter is also the zamindar, he is also the magistrate. What's the point in taking the matter to the court? So that's where we see the collusion throughout the 19th century.
I just wanted to ask a question about the relationship of, you had a number of slides that made reference to the Indigo Commission that took place as a result of what the indigo growers had revolted and led to the Indigo Commission, which then led to legislation related to the regulation of indigo. But what's the relationship of the indigo growers and their revolt, and then the British government having to put in place a commission? Do you think that's what helped to have the East India Company dissolved and the British government take more control? Is that the link that you're wanting us to see? Because we're talking about the East India Company and
right. So, well, the Indigo Revolt occurred in 1859, after the company was dissolved already in 1757. It's a kind of, I do see a connection between the general 1857 rebellion and the Indigo Revolt of 1859. So the commission was set up by the Crown Raj to find out what went wrong, that we ended up in this situation. What happened as a result of that revolt, that the industry, the indigo enterprise or the industry actually had to be relocated. So it relocated itself to further north in North Bihar, actually where I come from, where Tirhut Commissionary and Champaran eventually became the epicenter of indigo production after the Indigo Revolt. So it had a major impact on the enterprise, right? It had to be relocated. The Commission's report didn't recommend any legislation to fix the matter, right? And it talks about all the previous regulations that were in place, and the problem was that most of them, even if they were not brought with the intention to exploit peasants, but that was the impact. Eventually, all those regulations, they kind of facilitated indigo planters to carry on with their mission to make fortunes, without regard to what happened to the peasants. One recommendation the commission made was that there were several systems of indigo production, right? So one was that indigo planter, as a landholder, had his own land, right? And he could hire wage workers or other peasants to grow indigo on the land that they held, right, or owned. But that was very expensive, right? It was twice as expensive as forcing peasants under contract to grow indigo for them. And that's why there was never any intention, among the planters to grow what is called the niche cultivation, right? The cultivation of this plant on the land that planters owned, because that would be very expensive. And also, we need to remember that indigo, Bengal indigo, had to compete in Britain and other European markets with Spanish and French indigo. So the only way Bengal indigo could compete with other foreign, adversaries, British adversaries, was if it was obtained at a very low price, if it was put on the market at a competitive price. And that's why if the planters produced indigo on their land, which was twice as expensive as the common practice of, forcing peasants to grow indigo, this would not have survived. The whole enterprise would have collapsed. So I think we also need to think in terms of kind of global indigo market, where, and that's why, there were other regions that had traditionally produced indigo, but they were focused on Bengal because that was the only way they could have forced, because it was a colony, they could have forced peasants to grow indigo. So it had to be like that by design or by nature, right? And that's why they came up with the structures and institutions, policies, laws, and regulations to facilitate this enterprise. But the Commission itself doesn't recommend any specific guidelines with regard to legislation. But the legislations afterwards were exactly the same as they were before, right? Regulation 5, in a way, continued in place after 1858.
We now move to questions for our first witness by you, members of the public jury. Please limit your questions to 1 minute. Raise your hands if you have a question, and the presiding judge, Radha de Souza, will call out the questions.
Yes, this side, please.
Okay. I'm really interested in what you suggest in terms of the relationship of indigo cultivation to deforestation, but you do mention also the kind of possibility that extensive indigo cultivation in Bengal kind of in some sense exhausted the land. My understanding is that is a kind of legendary assertion, and that indigo as a legume is in fact nitrogen fixing and potentially regenerative for the soil, hence the revival of indigo cultivation, natural indigo today. I wondered if you have any thoughts about the possibility that indigo in the 19th century really exhausted the Bengali soil.
Right. Thank you for the question. Yes, I haven't come across any evidence that shows that it did exhaust the soil, right? But that was a common belief among peasants, precisely because they were responding to their situation and the exploitation that came with that. But I haven't come across any evidence to that. But there are other crops that were not so good for, especially if you cultivate each year, every year, right? The peasants that testified before the Indigo Commission, most of them, they were the ones who held a large, portion of land, right? Many of them, they owned or they had hundreds of acres of land. So they would rotate, right? So 1 year they will grow indigo on one plot of land, the next year they will do on the other. The main complaint that they had was, and especially when the revolt occurred in 1859, was that at that time the price of grain was much higher. So most indigo growing peasants, they thought that if they produced rice or other subsistence crops, they will benefit more. Indigo was not at all beneficial for them to grow. But in the beginning, they willingly accepted the advance and went for it because initial cultivation took place on the alluvial soil, right? After the inundations, you have this land that was there for peasants too. So they could grow indigo on them. But as it expanded and as it began to replace rice and other highland rice and other crops, that's when the problem began. And they began to resist. But they never liked to grow indigo.
Yes, here. Yeah.
Thank you for your testimony. You said that the peasants who cultivated indigo often didn't have the time to work their own land. So was there then a connection between cash cropping and then the later production of famine in Bengal? And if so, could you elaborate on that connection, please? Thank you.
Right. So what we see here, if like 1.4 million acres of land came under indigo cultivation, most of it, of course, were reclaimed from forests, but a large part of it was also the land on which peasants grew other subsistence crops, including rice, which had much higher value in the market. So certainly it had, proportionately it reduced the production of rice or other subsistence crops. As you may have noticed in the evidence that I put here, that the peasant who testified said that he planted 10 acres of rice, but it couldn't grow because the timing was wrong, right? He couldn't sow rice in time so that it would gain some strength to sustain and survive the summer, right? So, or the heat of the period. So timing was important. And sometimes you have the same time when you are expected to work or forced to work on indigo land or field, when that exactly was the time when they had to work for rice cultivation or other crops. So that certainly there was this issue that they were complaining about. And if you have this reduction in the production of subsistence crops, then you can see that when famines occurred, and there were many throughout the 19th century, right? This was exactly the indigo belt was exactly the area that suffered the most, right? You have high level of mortality because of the absence of subsistence or grain or rice for the peasants. And also because the prices were so high that they couldn't afford. So yes, there is a relationship between indigo production and high mortality that we see. And I think in one of the conversations we had before, it also, we need to think that even today, one of the most kind of impoverished or poor areas is coincidentally the area that produced indigo at the time, and Bihar and Bengal, parts of Bengal.
Yes.
My question really was also on the environmental legacy. And can you trace a line to today and the environmental damage that you think this has contributed to today in those regions? And I suppose it's also applying a counterfactual. Would that have happened absent the indigo trade which you've described?
Well, one thing that indigo production certainly contributed to deforestation and the damage to the natural environment in the region. But that's a trend that would have continued in any way, even if there was no indigo production, because one of the ways, or perhaps the only way that the British thought that the colony could be economically beneficial to them would be to force people to grow cash crops, right? Commercialization of agriculture. So that's why you see the large-scale production of not only indigo, but also opium. And we all are familiar with what happened with opium. You have jute here, the cotton there. All these crops, they were commercialized crops, cash crops. So if not indigo, something else would have happened. But for indigo, we certainly know that happened. Unfortunately, we cannot quantify the impact on environment. But imagine that 60, 70,000 acres of land was just cleared in 10 years during that, as the planter testified to the commission. This would have just, destroyed the biodiversity in the region. Right? Unlike plantations in the New World, in the Americas, in India, you don't have that kind of monocropping. Right? Indigo still was one of the many other commodities or crops that were grown. So it didn't have that kind of impact either on soil or on the people because it never ended up in a kind of monocropping plantations. What we cannot ignore is that as a result of this indigo enterprise and because of the rising industrialization in the West and the import substitution, right? You don't buy from your rivals like French and the Spanish, you get it from your colonies. It's contributed to the large-scale deforestation and depletion of resources, natural resources. And with that, the biodiversity and the ecology of the region. I don't know if there is any direct relationship between the cyclones that happen so often in the Bengal Delta. But certainly throughout the 19th century, there was this huge deforestation and rubber plantation has the same kind of consequence. You have now tea plantations taking place in the 19th century. The entire region had to be cleared. The forests had to be cleared. So all of those agricultural businesses, they had a toll on environment. Right? It's difficult for us to quantify, but.
Thank you for that. I mean, if I may, I just want to pick up on the question about famine and about the ecological impacts and push that a little more. You told us about deforestation and large-scale deforestation that occurred. In tropical countries, forests are part of the rain cycle. And so forests are absolutely central and essential for rainfall, which in most tropical countries, we have rain for 3 months and people live on that for 12 months. So this is a rain cycle. So would it be right to say that the deforestation is also the reason why there is climate change and why there is water scarcity, as they call it today? And if there were, it was also related to famines, of course, as you said, but also related to climate. Thank you.
Do you want me to respond to? Yes, certainly. I mean, any deforestation has an impact on the rain cycle. And what we see in the 19th century in Bengal, but also in other regions, you have rain failures, droughts, leading to famines and then mortality. So yes, there is a relationship between the large-scale deforestation and the rain cycles. I think one of the charges we have against this British Raj is that they never paid attention to the consequences of the commercialization of agriculture and the scale on which they forced people to grow cotton, opium, indigo, rubber, tea, jute. You have a series of crops that that were grown on a massive scale, which either took away land from rice, wheat, or other subsistence crops, or they were reclaimed from forests. But in either case, this would have damaging impact on the ecology and especially the rain cycle.
Yeah, thank you for that. There was one last question. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I was just wondering if you could explain a little bit about the wider context of land ownership in Bengal, the zamindari system, and how that might have been exploited by planters who were then given the right to rent or own land. Did they have land ownership rights or land rental rights as zamindaris? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for this question. It's a complex subject. The way it worked that, the East India Company, once it colonized Bengal, came up with this, fiscal measures, right? Their primary goal was to collect revenue from peasants, right? So they came up with what we call the permanent zamindari settlements, right? So individuals were given land grants in perpetuity, and they were responsible to collect revenue from peasants in that area, the grant, and pass it on to the company, right? If the zamindar, or the holder of that grant, failed to do that, then that right was given to somebody else, right, who could do the job better. So that was the original idea of this permanent settlement. But if the grantee was granted a land that was not inhabited by peasants, like forests, the zamindars claimed kind of ownership rights. So it was their responsibility to clear the forest, make the land cultivable. They could invite peasants to settle in those areas, or get the wage workers to produce for them. But by the 19th century, as we see more and more private British capitalists, they began to invest in land. They began to claim that zamindari rights. They took it as the ownership rights, right? And there were many examples when they evicted peasants, and there was a legislation actually to stop that one. But they were given the rights to bring more land under cultivation. So that's why you have forested areas given to them as grants. But if there were villages, the only right they had was to collect revenue from peasants. So it was not considered as ownership right. The peasants were the owners of land. That's, to my understanding, that was the situation. Yeah. Thank you.
Comrade Sousa, that means questioning has ended.
Just before we move on to the other next witness, I would just like to share with you, if you are interested, a novel of fiction, work of fiction on indigo planters and indigo peasants that you have heard about. And it's called The Tattooed Fakir. So just throwing it, just something more interesting. So The Tattooed Fakir is a novel based on this, everything that you have heard here. So we can now move on to the next witness. Please call out the next witness.
I call upon the second witness, Comrade Leonida Odongo, a Kenyan social justice activist, founder of Haki Nawiri Africa. She works with women, young people in the struggle for food and climate justice. Comrade Odongo, you have 20 minutes for your testimony. In the last minute, you will hear a bell.
Thank you for the space. First of all, I'm going to, whatever Ghulam presented is actually linked to what I'm going to be presenting. I come from Kenya, which was a British We had Britain as a colonial master. And if we talk about corporate capture, we still have British companies operating in Kenya. One of them is Unilever. And the company that I'm going to talk about is Agra. But this is not just the only company that we have in Kenya. It's actually a reflection of many other multinational corporations that are operating not just in Kenya, but across Africa. You'll be asking yourself, who is AGRA? And what type of a company is AGRA? AGRA stands for the Alliance for Green Revolution in Africa. It changed the name. It used to have the full name, but now because of backlash, particularly by organizations that deal with food, it decided to just stick to AGRA instead of talking about the Alliance for Green Revolution in Africa. And this company was registered in 2006, and it got funding from the Rockefeller Foundation as part of the very initial institutions that gave money for AGRA to operate. And just some of the examples of countries where AGRA is operating. And as I said, it's a multinational corporation, meaning that it's operating in various countries. One of them is Kenya, Ghana, Uganda, Burkina Faso, Mozambique, Ethiopia, Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania. If I'm to share some of the charges leveled against AGRA, one would be corporate takeover of our food systems. What AGRA does is that it's interested or has invested in seed sector. And this is through, first of all, working with scientists to come up with different seed varieties. And all this is through biotechnology. For AGRA, biotechnology is the silver bullet to address food insecurity in Africa. The other thing is to influence policies that exist in different countries. In Kenya, we have a draconian legislation. It's called the Seed Act, Seed and Plant Varieties Act. With this particular legislation, what happens is that farmers are not allowed to exchange seeds. They're not allowed to sell seeds. Indigenous seeds are considered as uncertified. And all this is because of AGRA's interest in seeds. And then we also have, within this legislation, there are punitive clauses. For example, if you are found sharing or exchanging seeds, you can, it's a criminal offense. You can be taken to court for a period of 2 years, or you pay 2 million Kenya shillings. The question is, how many smallholder farmers can afford 2 million Kenya shillings? Or how many, and this is a country where 70% of the population lives in rural areas and depends on agriculture. The other thing is failure. AGRA claims to double the incomes of smallholder farmers, and this was by 2020. From 2020 to date, it's almost more than 4 years. And the number of the poverty levels amongst farmers in Kenya and in Africa still continues to soar. If I can give an example of Kenya as a country in terms of hunger, and this is the evidence here. If you look at the Global Hunger Index, this is 2024. Kenya is actually number 100 out of 127 countries. That really tells you that the claim by AGRA that it's actually reducing hunger levels is a lie. And when we talk about, AGRA also talks about doubling the incomes of farmers, 30 million farmers across Africa, across the 11 countries where AGRA is operating. When you do an analysis of poverty levels amongst farmers, you find that farmers are getting more and more poorer, irrespective of the fact that AGRA has been working in these countries since 2006. And if we look at what was being presented by Ghulam and link that to what I'm going to be talking about, we can see that in matters of trade, the exploitation, as I said before, Kenya used to be called Imperial British East African Company. And so this was basically, first of all, Kenya was a settler state, meaning that the colonialists would stay there forever. And why was that so? Because the weather was conducive. There was access to free labor because there was introduction of various legislations that made it very simple for access to land, like the Crown Land Ordinance, where land could be used by Britain for as much as 999 years. And I also want to point out that the past and the present are actually linked, because if you look at our constitution now, yes, in the past it was 999 years, but right now our constitution allows for multinational corporations to operate for a period of 99 years. This is actually like a perpetuation of this oppression. And it does not mean that this land does not belong to someone. It means the land was taken away from the local people. For example, if you talk about the tea plantations that are owned by Unilever Company, the land belonged to the local people, but to date, the land has never reverted to the original owners, meaning that squatterdom has become the order of the day. And if I just want to give a brief on agriculture in Kenya, basically, as I said before, 40% of the population get their sources of income or employment from agriculture. So that really tells you how important this sector is to us. And then if I am to give just a brief situation that allows for Agra to continue to thrive in our country, is one that we have the triple burden of malnutrition. We have very high levels of malnutrition in the country. And one of the areas of interest for Agra is nutritional aspects. And then the environmental and sustainability. If you look at Kenya as a country, one is that 2022 was we had our worst drought. And also in 2019, we had desert locust infestation. We all know that there's a direct relationship between desert locust and climate change, particularly because if the weather becomes too warm for them, they continue to reproduce. And over 22 counties, we are divided into counties, 47 of them. Over 22 counties were affected by the desert locusts. We all hear Agra talking about climate smart agriculture or climate smart food production processes. Then if that is actually true, why didn't Agra save Kenya as a country from the desert locusts, particularly through the use of technology? And then, of course, we have social inequity in the country, where we have women do not control land. There's a lot of discrimination. In Kenya and in Africa as a continent, women are the food producers, majority of those who produce food. And lastly, there's the element of neglect of our cultural values. Where I come from, in Africa, food is not just to fill the stomach. Food has cultural connotations. For example, during marriages, there are special foods that are cooked. When you're going to get married, you're actually given seeds as a symbol of the beginning of life. There are food that are only cooked during burials and not any other time. There are also food that is only prepared for lactating mothers so that they can produce more milk for the babies. But what these multinational corporations are doing to our food systems is that they are also interfering with our culture. If I can give the example of Kenya, is that our constitution talks about respect for culture. Then we ask ourselves, what is cultural about genetically modified organisms? There is a disconnect between culture and GMOs. And if I'm to look at the methodologies of corporate havoc in our countries, one is through legislations. Like I shared about the Seed Act, we have another one called the Irish potato regulations. And this is one of the legislations of which AGRA is very much interested in. And why is that so? Because in Kenya, 800,000 households produce Irish potatoes. Just try to imagine how much AGRA would make in a day if they come up with legislations that influence the production of Irish potatoes. The other one is debts. Through agri-loans, the multinational corporations are coming together with the finance institutions to start giving farmers microcredit, and this comes through loans. But we depend on rain-fed agriculture. What happens when there's no rain and we don't have irrigation systems? It means that farmers are going to have to sell off their land in order to be able to pay back these loans. And even young people are getting targeted, particularly through agribusiness. They're told that you're going to come out of poverty. They're told that you're going to get very rich very fast. But then they're not given solutions that work. Because, for example, you find that these companies, when you go looking for a loan, let's say, for example, for an irrigation system, they're not going to give you, they're going to put so many conditions for you. But if you ask for seeds and agrochemicals, they'll tell you just sign here very, very fast, you know. And so that is how they're interfering with our food systems. And then just to give a brief on the different corporate tentacles, examples of corporate tentacles, there's something called the capture of space. What you can see there is an African Green Revolution Forum. And this brings together government officials, presidents, international financial institutions to come together and discuss about food, how to improve food systems in Africa. And of course, after these conferences, what normally happens is they come up with declarations. And these declarations are often supported by the African Union. And with this support of if there is corporate capture of African Union by multinational corporations, it means that each and every, because all the African countries are members of the African Union. So it means that whatever is discussed is going to be actually cascaded into all these countries. Another example is the African Union's fertilizer conference. And this, as a result of this, and this was very, very recent, that was 2024, they came up with the need to double, or to triple, sorry, the fertilizer intake in Africa. And are the guys that our soil is dead, but then they're not telling us the real culprit when you talk about the dead soil, because the real culprit is actually the overuse of synthetic fertilizers on our soil. And with the fertilizers, it's not just about killing the ecosystem, but also it ends up in our bodies when we consume water, because we get our water from the rivers, we get our water from rain. And so we're actually consuming all these fertilizers back into our bodies. And that's why you find that in many African countries, the incidences of cases of cancer are very high, and this can be traced to the type of food that we consume. And then, of course, this is when I talk about corporations and the relationship between corporations and government and communities as well. There's something called philanthrocapitalism. They come under the guise that they're coming to solve our problems. But in reality, there is extraction. There's extraction of labor. There's takeover of land. Like in Africa right now, very many countries, people are losing their land because of trade deals that are signed between governments and the companies. And just to reinforce the power of trade, I have another evidence here on the power of trade, and this is a book by Yash Tandon. It speaks about what's happening in the African continent, and it looks at trade as war, you know. And basically, if you go through this book, you'll see all the different types of exploitations. Like, for example, the international financial institutions predetermine different policies in our countries. They also have like set up protectionist clauses in that you see that what's coming from Africa goes through a lot of scrutiny, even the type of food, for instance. Like in Kenya, we export French beans to Europe. You find that it has to have a certain shape. If it's not straight enough, then it goes back to Africa. But then the question is, who determines, who takes scrutiny of what comes from Europe going to Africa? We all see that Africa is the dumping ground for so many things that come from Europe, from food to so many other things. And if I can give an example of Ghana, Ghana had a proper food systems, and it was producing chicken enough for the population. But because of WTO rules and dumping, and chicken were being sold to Ghana in terms of you could go to a supermarket and pick the part of chicken that you want. Perhaps you want the drumstick, or you only want the wings. And so what did this do to the local Ghanaian farmer? He could no longer sell a whole chicken because the farmers were selling entire chicken. In Africa, normally we sell whole chicken, not different types or pieces of chicken. And this actually changed Ghana to become an importer of food because there is no market for your chicken. And if the example you're seeing there is examples of state corporate collusion to continue to commit ecological crimes. You can see a cow there. Jidunge kwanza means you should inject yourself first. This was actually a push for vaccination that was being pushed by the president. And one thing I want to share is that Bill Gates was in Kenya last year, yeah? And even we had the Department of Trade, the US Department of Trade members come to Kenya. And so we all know who's the king of vaccines. I don't have to mention it. You all know who the king of vaccines is. And so if you look at the numbers in terms of vaccination, you'll see 22 million cattle are to be vaccinated. You're seeing 23 million sheep, 35 million goats against foot and mouth disease. Ask yourself, how much money is Bill Gates going to get out of this? Yes, there was an uproar in terms of linking him to this particular vaccination, but then the government came and said that it's not Bill Gates that's pushing this. It's actually the government that wants the livestock to be free from foot and mouth disease. But we all know because you can read between the lines. The other way is training of scientists to perpetuate industrial food production. They are given scholarships, taken to the US, and then when they come back, the knowledge that they bring to our institutions are often knowledge on biotech, that you need biotechnology to solve your food problems, which is actually not the real solution. Of course, there's a direct link between AGRA and policies, and I already elaborated on that. Donors, and one thing I want to point out is that if we talk about AGRA, UKAID is one of the donors of AGRA. Same for former USAID. BMZ also contributes money. And also within AGRA, there's also other development institutions that provide money, and also businesses. So it's actually, AGRA is a collusion, like bringing everyone on board. And specific crimes to AGRA, and these are localized crimes. One is corporate capture of policy. I already elaborated that. Training of village-based advisors. You can see that lady. She's in a rural community in Kenya. You cannot see anything organic in that shop. She's actually selling agrochemicals, and she's also giving advice. And who does this training? It's AGRA. And then you can see that is Agnes Kalibata. That's actually Africanizing multinational corporations, because when you see an African face, you can actually, you'll give more trust because you'll say that this is one of us. While in actual sense, this is about extractivism in the continent. And I'm just going to elaborate some of the misses of AGRA. One, as I said before, Kenya is 100 out of 127 in terms of hunger. 34.5 of Kenyan population, we have 50 million people in Kenya. That comes to like 17,500,000 and something people who are undernourished. 17.6% of 50 million are actually stunted. And this is a country where AGRA has been operating. In fact, Nairobi is the headquarters of AGRA. So in reality, this is quite shameful that we should be having undernourished, wasted, hungry people where AGRA is supposed to be operating. I just want to point out something on that picture there. Those are actually 5 Kenyan presidents that have been flagging food relief. It's actually very shameful to be flagging food relief in a country that is based in a continent that has 60% of arable land, that has the most youthful population in the world, that has a conducive weather for food production. And just to end it, I also like to point out that Kenya lifted, there was a push to lift the ban on genetically modified organisms in Kenya. And this was, of course, being pushed by the multinationals so that they can have a market for their products. And fortunately, we had 3 organizations go to court. And there is, it's just something that we are following up because you know that multinational corporations have a lot of power. And to make it even worse, we had the trade minister tell us that there are so many things that can kill you as a Kenyan, such that adding GMOs to the list is not something that is so, so we actually we should be ready to die anytime. And this is coming from a government official. Just to show you a few maybe slides of how we are resisting corporate capture. One is creating seed libraries in communities, and these are indigenous seeds. We know that indigenous seeds are more resilient to climate change, and as I said before, when we consume food as Africans, we don't just eat it to fill our stomachs. It has cultural connotations. And this is an indigenous people's territories. Those are Ogiek people. They've also been evicted from their home. In Mau Forest. They've been staying there since time immemorial, but now they're being evicted, being told that they're destroying the environment and cutting down the trees. And just a quote, seeds are part of our cultural heritage and our most crucial input in farming. Small-scale farmers have, over the years, improved various crops, because we believe that farmers are scientists. And these are quotes from practitioners. And then local communities have always lived in unison with nature, and so have the practices that they've been using over the years. And what should be done, that is an example of a seed bank in the community. When you harvest, the way you take money to the bank is the same way now you take seeds to this particular space. And all those are indigenous seeds. What needs to be done is to defund AGRA, support and finance agroecology, capacity building for farmers to adopt agroecology, and lobbying food producers to be at the center of decision making. Repeal of punitive clauses and global solidarity on food systems, because whether you're in the global north or global majority, we all consume food. Whether you're rich or poor, we can't tell our stomachs to take a break. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your testimony. We now move to questions to our second witness from the judges for the next 15 minutes.
Yeah, you want to have? Yeah.
Well, I have a very punctual question. Some friends and people from Rwanda have told us about how AGRA was instrumental in regionalizing the possibility of cultivating some crops. So it is like forcing a kind of regionalization of what can be cultivated in some areas. And my question is that if something like that happens also in Kenya.
Thank you for the question. In Kenya, what happens is that we have different agroecological zones, so meaning that different products can grow in different places. And this is also related to colonialism, because like areas, a place like Kericho, which is very cold, is conducive for tea production. And that is where there's a lot, like that's where Unilever operates, in an area of over 5,000 acres of land. And yes, that regionalization is happening, particularly because different crops fit in different places. And the same for livestock, you know, like the camels are thriving very well in the northern part of Kenya because it's dry. Crops like coffee are doing very well in central part of Kenya. And so that division happens. But from a research that was done on Agra, it actually shows that 41% of the community has become poorer in terms of food production as well as incomes, despite the fact that that is also one of the countries that Agra is operating in. Thank you.
Yeah, you want to go? Yeah.
Kenya was colonized by the British
Yes.
in the previous 1800s, somewhere around there. And they introduced the concept of corporations, colonies. They set up a royal charter company in Kenya. Can't remember the name of it, but I remember they did that. But now you have a situation where these corporations have now morphed into these agricultural corporations who are then now forcing people into really what was told to us earlier by the indigo process that happened with forcing people into growing indigo. Now you have a situation where people are being forced to move away from their traditional food production into an agribusiness. And then I just saw the slide about the chemicals that are given, it's told you if you buy this and put this on the crop, it'll grow better. But actually what happens is in the long run, it actually kills the land. So people are more impoverished because of that use of that fertilizer. So you're kind of in a kind of a rut, so to speak, with this agribusiness that they're forcing onto your people. And so I can see where the the East India Company with this monoculture, growing indigo, now has been morphed into other areas of the world, like your area with Kenya, but it's also impoverishing the people. That's what I'm seeing from your slides that you showed us today. Am I
Yeah.
summarizing it okay?
Yeah. Yes.
Did I miss anything?
No, you didn't.
Oh, okay, good. No, my question is that you heard the previous speaker talking about the indigo trade. Can you see the links of what happened there and what's happening in your country?
Yes, there's a lot of relationship between Kenya and India. I don't know whether I mentioned this. For example, tea was introduced to Kenya from India in 1901. And to date, the tea is still being produced. And when you talk about monocrops, tea is one of the monocrops. Actually, they use a lot of chemicals in the tea plantations. First of all, because of the expansive nature of the land under tea production. And when they are spraying, they use aeroplanes. They actually do aerial spraying. And when you talk about exploitation of the tea plantation workers, the spraying is done when the tea pickers are picking the tea. So what happens is that they end up getting skin infections, and also they inhale a lot of these chemicals. And the other sad thing is that they live like in a casualized labor system, such that they are employed as casual labor. You can be a casual laborer even for 10 years. What they do is that when after a period of 3 months or just before 3 months, they send you home, and then you come back again as a new recruit. That way, they actually don't have to pay for your, medical and all these other. So you end up not getting a salary. You are permanently on wages. And the other thing that they do is that, like when they have the managers, the Unilever managers come from the UK, when they come to do any form of inspection, what happens is that the workers get their houses painted, freshly painted. If you don't have a TV set in your house, you're actually given. They even buy for you, sofa sets, and so you end up looking like you are doing okay during the inspections, which is actually a lie. And so the companies are using a lot of methods to try to show that they're actually doing well. And if you Google right now Kericho, you'll see the place looks very beautiful, very lush, very nice looking. But in reality, people overwork. There are even incidences of sexual violence. And there was a BBC expose of sexual violence where women have to exchange sex for promotions or even to get a job in the tea plantations. Yeah.
Thank you for that. I have a question, if I may. There were many issues that you highlighted which resonated with what Comrade Ghulam said before. Mm-hmm. One was finance, the investors coming into the agricultural sector, the forcing people to grow cash crops for trade, global trade in agricultural products, giving loans and credits to people so that they become indebted on a long term, and the whole investments in agriculture being a global one, but that is forcing people to change their own traditional methods of cultivation and growing in their own countries. These were all very common to both the presentations and the testimonies that we heard. But in addition, you mentioned certain things, certain aspects of Agra and its agricultural practices in Africa. One was introducing fertilizers, chemical fertilizers. The other was introducing GMOs, genetically modified organisms. And then you mentioned education of scientists in biotechnology and so on. And you said that these practices were introduced so that there could be more produce and people could benefit more, which you said has not happened. My question to you is this. This introduction of agricultural technologies, as generally, if you include GMOs, fertilizers, biotech and all of that, was this because the land during the colonial period had lost its fertility, had lost its productivity, and therefore they tried to introduce this? Or is this part of a trade in fertilizer and trade in GMOs and new ways of control mechanisms? In other words, is this new technology remedying something that failed in the colonial era? Or is this practice something else? How do we explain this new element that has come into agribusiness that was not referred to in the colonial period?
Okay. Thank you for the question. One thing I want to point out is that there's a lot, like as time goes by, as things change, technology is also changing. And now we have what is called emerging technologies, like there never used to be AI in the past, but now there's a lot of AI, particularly in agriculture. They talk about precision farming and all that. And so what I can say in response to that is that one thing is the population in the past was lower compared to right now. And if you talk about food production or agriculture in general, before infiltration of agrochemicals and all that, land was a bit productive. But we all know that all multinational corporations, whether in the past or in the present, all they want to make is profit, and not just profit. They want abnormal profits. And that is why now they continue. There's a collusion between the different multinational corporations. And I can say that if you're talking about food, food is intersectional. It touches on education, like, for example, nutritional information. It touches on labor, like who works on the land, the issues around machineries and mechanized farming. And so what I can say is that they want to be at par with technology as it's happening, but also being cognizant of the fact that populations are rising and they need to make more and more profit. And that is why, for example, we are told that when you use chemicals, you're going to make a lot of money, and you're also going to be able to feed yourself. And that is why now the likes of Bill Gates are thriving, because biotech is being pushed as the magic bullet to address food insecurity, while they don't take care of the root causes of the food insecurity, issues around land, because how much land has these companies utilized, land that would have gone to produce food for the people? We end up, like in Africa, we are producing what we don't consume, and we are consuming what we don't produce. We're actually consuming what comes from the West, and what we sell is converted into foreign exchange. And then there's also the aspect of the debt burden and how debt affects our food. If I can share, we had 2024, we had protests in Kenya, and this was because of a finance bill that was being pushed by World Bank. So people are getting taxed to the extent that they cannot afford food. And with the protests also, there also came the abductions and all that. So we can see the linkage between shrinking civic space, particularly on people who express themselves about the situation, and food insecurity.
Thank you. We now move to questions to the second witness by you, members of the public jury. Please limit your questions to 1 minute. Raise your hands if you have a question, and presiding judge Radha de Souza will call out the questions.
Any questions? Oh, yes, there.
Hi, thank you so much. You mentioned about the indigenous seeds versus the GMO seeds, and you said that the indigenous seeds they're not certified. Does that mean that if you grow crops with these, then you're not able to sell them? Or how does that affect? Because you were saying that you have the seed banks and you're trying to, or there are organizations that are trying to bring the indigenous seeds back in. Are the farmers able to then sell them and make profit from this, or is that just for their own consumption?
Okay, in terms of certification, one thing I want to point out is that the certification process is not free. You have to pay some money for the certification process. And this is just a push by the multinational corporations for standardization, and also to enable them to do marketing over a large scale. For instance, if the same seed in Kenya will be sold in South Africa, will be sold in Rwanda, because they have the same standard. Yeah, and so that is why they are bringing these conditions, because one thing they know that farmers do not have money, because with the certification you have to do it every year, annually, and you have to show that certificate of, you are certified. You have to have evidence of certification. And the other thing that this legislation do is that they don't recognize the indigenous seeds. despite the fact that these are seeds that have been consumed over and over again since time immemorial. And so with this legislation, what they do is that farmers are forced into going to buy seeds from the agrovet. And this agrovet, you see, like if you look at the different types of seeds, they're almost looking the same. Maybe the difference might be the package. Okay, I want to point out that nobody has been taken to court over these seed laws, but just that fear of, potential being taken to court, because if it's put in the law, in the Kenyan context, it means anytime you can be taken to court over that particular legislation. And why we say that indigenous seeds are more resilient to climate change, one is that they're not 100% dependent on agrochemicals, because it's like when you go to buy the seeds from the agrovets, you're actually buying a package. You come with the seeds, but also with the agrochemicals. And it's at every level, because even at harvest, they're now producing like containers which already have some chemicals smeared on them, where after harvest you put your seeds there and they don't get attacked by weevils and all that. But in traditional society, we already had our own systems of drying seeds. We have 100% sunshine. We can use the sun to dry our food. We can use cow dung to actually protect our harvest from infestation by weevils. We can use ash, to you smear the ash on the crops you've harvested, and you're actually eliminating the moisture, but also preventing any infestation. You can take your seeds and actually put them in the kitchen, because we use open fire, and that fire, that seed will stay there for many years and it will not even lose its vigor. So what I can say is that what the multinational corporations are doing, they're actually creating a market for themselves and for their products, and then collusion with different governments. They're actually working together so that they can continue to reap from Africa, because the continent has over 300 million smallholder farmers. Just imagine if in one day the farmers were buying, let's say, an agrochemical for 1 sterling pound, how much money would a company that is producing that make? And also we're seeing a lot of mergers and takeovers by companies, coming together. The smaller companies are being bought off. And now we have like only 4 companies in the seed and agrochemical. And so they're really making a lot of money. And that's why they're using countries and greedy leaders to continue to perpetuate these oppressions. Thank you.
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Is there any consumer pressure we can do from here, or is that really not going to work because there's so many livelihoods that are dependent on the current food production, even though it's not working for them?
Okay, there's a lot that can be done, and this is one of the spaces where information is being disseminated, for example, on the realities of what's happening in Africa. And the other thing you can do is speak out, solidarity, North-South solidarity would also work. Like, for example, if people are having protests, you can maybe share it out, with your family members or with the different groups that you are. But then the other thing that's very crucial is to fund agroecology, because agroecology is where you produce food, but you're also taking care of the ecosystem. We know that even research on agroecology is not funded. Governments in Africa are only interested in, food production processes that bring in money. To them, they look at agroecology as something that is not bringing in money. So looking at funding aspects is very, very important. Linking up, those smallholder farmers with institutions or even researchers that are for the people, that actually are supportive of regenerative systems of food production, and also creating spaces where, like, for example, with university students, where this information can be shared as part of popular mobilization, and this deliberate popular mobilization to change the narrative, particularly about what's happening in Africa and also about the food systems. As I said, food is a connector. Whether you're in the global south or global north, we all consume food, and we need to be demanding, food that is healthy, food that is clean, but also ensuring that the food producers actually get a return on investment of all the efforts that they put on the soil.
If I may just push you on that response and ask a further question before I come to other questions. You mentioned North-South solidarities, you mentioned what people can do and educate them by telling them what is happening and your struggles. But I also wondered, many of these companies, including Agra, they have their head offices in the United States, in Europe, in Britain, in these countries. So what can people here do about the corporatization of agribusiness, which is what your entire evidence was about?
Things that can be done. One is to call for defunding of these institutions. In last year, what we did was just before the Africa Green Revolution, where I showed you that was happening in Rwanda, we had a press conference and we were sharing the realities and the failures of Agra across different African countries. And this was a mix of religious leaders, civil society, smallholder farmers, all coming together to speak with one voice. And as a result of that, what happened is that Agra changed its strategy, and that is when also it changed the name. Instead of using the Alliance for Green Revolution in Africa, now it's only using the name Agra. And some of the institutions that were funding Agra, actually, some of them stopped funding. So such instances, for instance, using the media or even going to speak to the media would really help, and particularly if you have those companies in your cities, you can also organize demos or just to show what the impacts that these companies are having, because they not only affect us now, they're affecting us into the future. Thank you.
One last question.
I was I studied about 20 years ago, small farmers, ecology. So all of this really resonates. I wondered if you could just elaborate and explain the relationship between what I would call donor funding and philanthropy, where the big continual question in Africa is how do you mobilize small farmers to produce enough for themselves, to be part of the cash economy so they can send their kids to school, etc., etc. There is I think a lot of people with good hearts wanting to contribute to that dynamic. But what is that relationship between the agribusiness industry that sees an opportunity to make money? Because I came from that space of organic, local farmers, but it was very much where all the jobs in that philanthropy sector were very reliant on agri-chemicals. And I kind of came out of it probably about 10 or 15 years ago. So, but just for everybody else, could you explain that relationship, that intricate relationship between donors like USAID, like DFID, and this agribusiness industry?
What should be done, first of all, is schooling them on these negative impacts, and maybe taking them to the community so that they can see this impact and not just what I can say, not just the sad stories, but actually see like farmers who are actually practicing agroecology and thriving in agroecology. And also what the question that is normally asked, for example, by even companies and governments is, can agroecology feed the world? So they're just looking at the economic economic benefits, but when you look at agroecology in its totality, there is the ecosystem aspect, there is the balancing of the ecosystem, there is the rejuvenation of life, the bees that had disappeared actually come back, and the soil that was dead is actually getting its life back. I think maybe what needs to be done, apart from the information aspect, is also looking at, like, if you're able to take these philanthropo-capitalist organizations to where the change is, perhaps that will help to, change their mindset about food production. But I also think that food producers need to be more organized, because if you look at agroecology, many a times you find that people just do their own farming in their own corner on their own. So there's also need to look at how do we build, movements of food producers who can come together and make demands and all that. But also there is it's important to have consumers become more organized to demand for healthy food, because if you just go and eat anything, it means that these multinational corporations will continue to produce what they want using the agrochemicals. But if you're actually demanding for the right food, for the food devoid of chemicals, then these organizations will be forced to shift from whatever they are funding to be able to fund what is clean, what is healthy, and what is ecologically right.
Thank you, comrades. Questioning has ended. I call upon the advocates. Comrade Ruth Nyambura, a Kenyan feminist activist scholar who works on ecological justice for marginalized peoples and convenes the eco-feminist Ramani Collective. Comrade Nyambura, you have 25 minutes for your expert evidence, and in the final minutes you will hear a bell.
Thank you very much. So I will try to make sense of time and history. The late, great journalist, activist from Uruguay, Eduardo Galeano, had a quote, a very famous quote, in which he said that history doesn't say goodbye, it only says see you later. So in both the case of the EIC in colonial Bengal and Agra in neoliberal Africa, what is clear is that we have inherited a global financial, monetary, and macroeconomic infrastructure where the lines and circuits of exploitation remain the same and firmly reinforced. While the colonial state in Bengal worked directly and exclusively in the interests of metropolitan capital, in the case of the East Indian Company, the present neoliberal state has worked directly and exclusively in the interests of international finance capital in the case of Agra, formerly the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa. I'll also be returning to the complexities of the Green Revolution and going back to time and memory and history. So what sustains exploitation over time? How can we make sense of the exploitation of farmers, of peasants, of Indians in Bengal, and the exploitation of African peasants, exploitation of African women farmers, exploitation of smallholder farmers in Africa? How can we connect 300, 400, 500 years of exploitation across two continents, but literally as a symbol of the long legacies of enslavement, of colonialism, of indentured servitude, of the last 50 years of neoliberal globalization, and in this epoch that we now find ourselves in the context of growing fascism across the world? So what sustains exploitation over time? Narratives and hegemony. The ideological underpinnings and creation of colonization structured those who were colonized as primitive, as backward. The civilizing project, so-called civilizing project of the East Indian Company, but the colonial project itself in India, in which farmers, or the people of Bengal, were labeled as backward. And so a plantation economy or monoculture farming was seen as the way to civilize the people I will start with a little bit a story. One of the things that is not often talked about when you talk about the Green Revolution, and specifically in the context of what they're now calling the new Green Revolution in Africa. Because the very first iteration of the Green Revolution was in the 20th century. And this was supported by the Ford Foundation, Henry Ford, who famously made his billions by basically being an automobile giant, and the Rockefeller Foundation. And the Rockefeller family made its billions in the context of being an oil industry giant. And they transformed themselves into philanthrocapitalists, or rather organizations that fund social justice and democracy across the world. So we see that in the original iteration of the Green Revolution in the 20th century, in Mexico, in India, in Punjab, and in the Philippines, well, we're told the idea was to basically lift, the lives, to uplift rather the lives of farmers in these places. The actual reality is actually much more complicated and goes back to ideology, narratives, and hegemony, and the ideas of the construction of the world. The original Green Revolution had less to do with lifting or uplifting the lives of peasant farmers in the Philippines, in Mexico, in India, but rather was about combating communism and socialism, was about stopping peasant farmers from being able to redistribute land from the landed elites in their countries. It was as simple as that. It was less to do with uplifting the lives of peasant farmers, but an ideological project which had serious material impact. And that's why the Green Revolution in the iteration that we have now in Africa has to also be seen within that canon, right? How do narratives, how does ideology, right, result in the space of accumulation across time? We see colonization in the context of Bengal, and of course the ideological civilizing mission. And in Agra in the 21st century, right, it is a continuation of stopping the people, the poor, the working class, the women in Africa who produce the majority of the food, of being able to seize the means of production for themselves. But rather, as we've seen from the previous speaker, is basically about opening up the continent of Africa so that international agribusiness companies can continue to exploit. In order to exploit the world has to be constructed in the image of the exploiter. The people have to have an imaginary and aspirations in order to become the exploiters. So you need a local elite class and a subdued exploited mass, whether we are talking about colonial Bengal or whether we are talking about farmers across Africa in the 21st century. So that is the first thing. You sustain exploitation over time through narratives and the creation of hegemony. In addition to that, to sustain exploitation and accumulation across time, you have to think about the role of regulatory and legal regimes. We have heard about regulations being passed across Africa, not just within the space of specific countries, but the harmonization of seed and trade laws, but also intellectual property rights laws that criminalize the rights of peasant farmers to save, sell, and exchange their seeds, while at the same time opening up space for the Monsantos and the buyers to be able to invest on the continent. We see also in colonial Bengal the ideas of transformation around private property rights and contracts. This also includes questions around labor, and we have had that from our previous, from Ghulam in his presentation. In addition to that, the long histories of trade, finance, and investment portfolios. So nothing has value anymore until it has been transformed into a commodity in the service of agribusiness or in the service of metropolitan capital. So for the East Indian Company, what we have now is Monsanto Bayer, transnational corporations concerned with taking from the poor, the working class, women, and those on the front lines of multiple and intersecting crises that have been created because of the long legacies of colonialism, capitalism, and neoliberal globalization. In addition to the sustaining of accumulation across time, we must indict the multilateral system, specifically the United Nations. And I know this might be a bit strange, but when we talk about conversations around rights discourse, but no substance, the pretense of equality and justice, where smallholder farmers across Africa are pitted against farmers who get subsidies in the United States of America, where exploited farmers in Bengal are pitted against basically the consumption patterns of those who live in the heart, of the metropole, basically. So Bengal farmers are encouraged to work harder to get out of debt, while African women in the 21st century are seen by Agra or are encouraged to see themselves as entrepreneurs, that they can entrepreneur themselves out of poverty. But the legacies of colonialism across Africa, where land, we still have historical questions around land. In a country like Kenya, for example, where every single election, there are tensions because the land question, which is connected to the issue of class and has gained an ethnic angle to it, has never actually been settled. So questions around land, factors of production, questions around seed, social relations, and as our speaker, Leonida, spoke about the fact that seeds or food is not just about a culture, it's not just about a factor of production. We are talking about culture. We are talking about spirituality. All these questions, including the economic questions, are obscured and subsumed within this development narratives from Bengal to Kenya in the 21st century, and where African women farmers are encouraged to entrepreneur themselves out of poverty, which basically leads to debt traps. We also see that legal and regulatory regimes across time both transform but also reflect the material changes and realities across societies. The state, whether it is the crown, and the state, whether it is the Kenyan state or the 13 other countries that AGRA actually operates in, not only deregulates, but also works to re-regulate for the market directly or via proxy through not just Monsanto, Bayer, but also through AGRA. So basically what we see is copy and paste laws across time that essentially function to open up the space for accumulation. So what we see is that between Bengal and between Agra in Kenya, but across the continent of Africa, that this is basically a wider project of enclosures of the commons. But the most important thing is that we have to return these conversations to the historical questions and the structural questions. When development questions invisibilize, for example, capitalism, and the role that capitalism plays or the economic system plays in the context of exploitation, where we're encouraged to move on from colonialism, for example, that this is 100 years after independence. Why are you still bothered about the legacies of colonialism? Should you not be developed? So I want to semi-conclude with 2 points. One is the state-corporation nexus. States, as we can see, have always needed corporations, and corporations have always needed the state. The state has the tools to enforce hegemony, the ideological tools, the material tools, but also the fact that the state always has a monopoly over violence. Whether we are talking about the crown, whether we are talking about the state via the East Indian Company, or whether we are talking about the Kenyan state, and its ability, one, to pass legislation that criminalizes the rights of smallholder farmers to sell and exchange their seeds, the ability to actually hire seed inspectors who go from house to arrest farmers. So that whole array of violence, ideological, material, and violence, this is one of the ways in which the state and corporation exist. So the state has always needed corporations to exploit, While the state needs corporations for investments, as the state has in essence come to serve the interests of the ruling class. When we think about the state, not just as a physical, geographical, or juridical entity, but thinking about the state in the context of social relations, class relations, where the state across Africa and across time has essentially served in the interests of corporations, but also the elite of society. Even as we look at, for example, the long histories of the Green Revolution, whether in the Philippines, whether we are talking about India in Punjab, or whether we are talking about Mexico. So the EIC is the crown in Bengal, just as Shell is a Dutch kingdom in Ogoni, just as Monsanto is a US empire, and Agra, which is exploiting African farmers and destroying their ecosystem, is a representation of new forms of capital accumulation by the elites through philanthrocapitalism. So the state has always subsidized corporations, and the public function of the state continues to be hollowed out, especially when you look at the history of Agra. And I want to speak a little bit about beyond the long 20th century, thinking about the fact that the last 50 years of austerity and neoliberal globalization in Africa has meant that the African state or African governments have had the ability to actually fund the public sector, and in the context of agriculture in this case, has almost been completely destroyed because of the politics of austerity. So, and I remember a question that Judge Radha asked about how does Agra actually get a foothold in Africa, for example? One is the issue around how colonialism accumulates and encloses the commons across Africa. But the second aspect of it is the fact that austerity has destroyed the ability of the public, right? Has destroyed the public space. So Agra steps in to sort of feel what capitalism and austerity has destroyed, but also the long histories of colonialism. So that is how Agra actually gets a foothold, that the state, through capitalism, through this macroeconomic policies that have been pushed in the global south for the last 50 years, the state has been forced to deregulate, but also to re-regulate so that private interests can be able to get a foothold on the continent of Africa. So the de-investment through structural adjustment programs now gives Agra the ideological and material space to intervene within the African agriculture space. So the power to direct institutional changes towards opening up African agriculture to agribusiness. So the socialization of risks and the privatization of profits, as we can see from the EIC to Agra at present. And to conclude on that section, I want to talk about what is at stake, and because the court is around the climate crisis. The historical processes around the climate crisis continue to be viewed within a that this is simply a failure of technology, or simply in a very depoliticized techno-scientific form. The long histories of capitalism, the Industrial Revolution, colonialism, enslavement are often obscured from the conversation. Because to start with these historical legacies of the structural formations of the climate crisis means we arrive at a very different answer when it comes to the solutions, and which the solutions are not the false solutions that are constantly being pushed in terms of carbon markets, for example. So biodiversity loss and collapse across time in Bengal and across the continent of Africa through monoculture, agriculture, and plantations, and the cash crop economy, the legacies and contemporary issues must be brought back to the discussions around the climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis, but also thinking intergenerationally. We must speak about the economic foundations of the climate crisis, but we must also bring back history into the legacies and the conversations around the climate crisis. We must also, in that context, talk about the false solutions, the corporatization of the so-called solutions to the climate crisis and biodiversity crisis that we presently face, which in essence becomes a space to further open up our countries and our communities for accumulation by corporations. So Shell destroys Ogoni, companies destroy India, companies destroy Kenya. Then we are told that by paying carbon markets, by basically enrolling into carbon markets, then we are able to solve the crisis from the same space that we actually created the crisis. So we see the long histories of the slow violence of the climate and biodiversity crisis from Bengal to Kenya, and immanent to colonialism, neoliberal globalization and imperialism is a climate and biodiversity crisis. We cannot separate these long histories of exploitation from the formations of the climate and biodiversity crisis. So in conclusion, what is at stake? So we see the long enclosures of the commons in accelerated and expanded forms. The political struggles around sovereignty, whether it's seed sovereignty, whether it's food sovereignty, are reduced to depoliticized techno-scientific elaborations, conceptually, but also in the context of vocabulary. That there's a sense where we have lost a vocabulary of sovereignty and a vocabulary of freedom. We see that the radical class-gendered, racialized struggles rooted in historical political demands from Bengal to Kenya at present, right? Demands for reparations, demands against capitalism, anti-capitalism struggles, sovereignty struggles make way for co-opted, right, demands in very limited and narrow sense of the politics of rights. So the climate, biodiversity, seed, land crisis, questions around labor, questions around gender have to be returned to a politics of sovereignty, have to be returned to a politics of cross-movement, transnational work, of actually seeing the long histories of exploitation of the people across generations and across time. This is also one of the clearest ways to think about the climate crisis, to return them to their historical space, to the structural questions, the vocabulary in itself, but also in the conceptualization of the crisis. Thank you. Guys.
Thank you for your expert evidence. We now move to questions to our advocates from the judges for 15 minutes.
Do you want? Yeah, go ahead. Do you want to have a question? Okay. Thank you for assisting us with this task of trying to connect the temporalities. The first witness talked about East India Company in the 18th, 19th century. And you talked about, and the second witness talked about neoliberal context for this. We understand that when it comes to state corporation collaboration, the British Crown and the British East India Company, here we understand that it's the Kenyan state that produces the Seed Act, criminalizes seed saving and allows these companies to come in. My question to you is, if you can expand and talk a little bit about the legal and institutional infrastructures that facilitate global agribusiness on a global scale, because what you're talking about is the entire African continent, the entire Asian continent, and you mentioned Mexico, so presumably Latin America. That's pretty much the whole world. So what are the institutional and legal infrastructures? Who created them? And what are these institutions and laws that facilitate what the East India Company did on a global scale? So that would be my question.
All right. Thank you for that question. I think one of the most important things to begin with is, and again I say that history is very important, and it's a crime, in my opinion, to speak about exploitation without anchoring history. Colonialism, enslavement, for example, the transatlantic slave trade, to neoliberal globalization, is essentially a process around the enclosures of the commons. And I know I sit in a country that gave us the Enclosures Act. So to begin with that this is fundamentally a process of enclosures of the commons. And because it is an act, we begin to see at the very onset of enclosures that you need to transform the regulatory and the legal regime in order to direct accumulation, right? Accumulation in the context of the elites of the society, whether it's for corporations like the East Indian Company, or whether it's Agra, or whether it's Monsanto. So legal and regulatory regimes both transform accumulation, but also accumulation relies on legal regimes and that specific forms of transformation. So it is a dialectical process to begin with that. So one of the ways to think about it, and one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about AGRA, not just because AGRA is headquartered in Kenya, but AGRA works in 11 countries in Africa, but actually at present, AGRA has just, for example, in January, the whole of Africa, the continent of Africa, has something called CAADP, the Comprehensive Africa Agricultural Development Program. And this year, CAADP was being reworked for another 20 years. And AGRA, again, going back to the fact that 50 years of austerity has destroyed Africa's, and when I mean Africa, I mean the continent-wide, capability to invest in African agriculture, and AGRA has been spearheading that particular project, ideologically and materially. While the state, we cannot talk about the Kenyan state simply waking up in the morning and legislators, because in Kenya, laws are made by members of parliament. What we are seeing is that AGRA is actively lobbying for the changes within not just Kenya, but something we are called, and I think you asked the question about Rwanda, the harmonization of seed and trade laws across Africa. So we have one aspect of AGRA lobbying at the national level laws, that is Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, and we call them copy-paste laws because when you look at the act in Kenya, the Seeds Act, you look at the act in Tanzania, or you go to Uganda, they're essentially the same piece of legislation with just the country name that is different. But AGRA also lobbies within regional economic communities. What you have, like the EU, it also lobbies for example, we come from East Africa. The East Africa community also has a space for legislation, or COMESA, which is the common market for Eastern and Southern Africa, or ECOWAS, which is the West African community. So we are seeing multiple layers in which laws, policies are being transformed, right? Copy-paste laws in order to facilitate that form of accumulation. And again, as you say, the state isn't, you can't think about the state in the context of the geographical boundaries. Neoliberal globalization gave rise to something we now call the transnational state, where individual countries more or less act in service of multinational corporations, where you have a corporation, for example, like Tesla or Apple, for example, which has a bigger GDP than most countries in the world. So we live in a very, very different world in terms of the power. So this legislation isn't really about Kenya or Tanzania, but is the way in which transnational capital and the ways in which transnational politics in the last 50 years of neoliberal globalization is transforming the world. So the laws have to be seen, one, in the context of enclosures, and especially in the context of the last 50 years of a transnational state, not just a state in the context of geographical borders.
Do you want to? Yeah.
Well, it is very interesting what you have been saying. And I have a question around the development of AGRA into what now we see as not only in Kenya, but in many countries of Africa, the development of laws of privatization of seeds, those called laws of vegetal varieties and all those, no? Which are, of course, part of this devious scheme called UPOP, no? That is the union of tensions of vegetals, no? And my question is, if AGRA has promoted actively these laws of privatization of seeds, because of course that would be a development AGRA needs to maintain its level of grabbing not only land but seeds and all kind of contracts with the peasants and farmers. No?
Yeah.
So that would be my question.
Thank you for that question. And I actually want to go back to the fact that the idea of what seeds and crops to grow is not a recent history. This is actually colonial history. The colonial encounter across the global south or the global majority has always been that the colonial masters decided. In Kenya, we had the Native Crops Ordinance Act. This goes back to when we were a colony of the British Empire. I know India has a lot of similar legislation. So to begin with, again, going back to history, that the idea that farmers can only plant specific seeds or crops is actually a colonial thing that gets transformed within your liberal globalization. So that's the very first point. The second thing is that UPOV, and I want to sort of explain for maybe those who don't understand, UPOV is basically it's a convention on plant varieties, and it is based on intellectual property rights. To also say that the laws being passed around seeds in Africa are two types. One, we call them marketing laws or seed laws, and the others are called laws in relation to intellectual property rights. And you're right, that's one of the things that AGRA is doing across Africa. Many countries that are considered poor or least developed have exemptions from joining what we now call UPOV 91. There's UPOV and UPOV 91. UPOV 91 is very, very strict, and it's from UPOV 91 where very strict laws around breeders' rights, what to plant and what not to plant emerges from. Yet, most countries in Africa would ordinarily be exempted from actually acceding to a more strict regime of the UPOV Convention. But because of the lobbying work, not just of AGRA, but the lobbying work of developed, what we call, I hate to use the word developed because it's actually developed via exploitation of the South. It is because of bilateral trade treaties, for example, that the UK, for example, has several bilateral trade treaties with African countries as well as countries in the Caribbean. And some of the provisions they have in order to be able to join these treaties, trade treaties, in order to gain access to the British market, for example, is actually changing your national legislation to conform to UPOV 91 legislation. So you see the kinds of pressures that countries in the global south, whether it's in Africa, whether it's in the Caribbean, whether it's in Asia, that in order to be able to get market access, you must change your legislation. And that's why it's important to talk about how the old colonial formations of power, right, continue to exist, whether it's in terms of legal regimes, but also in coercion in the context of trade policies. So AGRA has worked a lot to ensure that countries such as Somalia, Eritrea, for example, join UPOV 91. That is one level in the context of intellectual property rights legislation. But at the other level is the seed and marketing laws that Leonida was speaking about. Literally, AGRA's work is a world-changing, it's a historical changing project that goes way beyond trying to deal with one or two countries, but is literally transforming the space of accumulation and exploitation in the context of Africa. A lot of civil society movements on the continent are actually calling it a second kind of colonization for Africa.
Do you want a question? Yeah.
I was told to bring it up slowly to my mouth so they could get the sound up. So I'm running. I wanted to ask you a question because something that was said earlier about the land. And at the time of colonization, the land was divvied up by the British, in Kenya I'm talking about, given by the British people to certain, I don't know, families or collectives. I don't know how it was divvied up. But when they supposedly decolonized, that structure remained in place, thereby depriving the original peoples of that territory from their land. So then now what happens is that the corporations come along and they attach themselves to this structure that's not of people's making, but it's something that was imported, which is really what happened with the East India Company, because they brought in their own regime and then used that regime to legitimize what they're doing. And my question is, how much has the state, you know, that are involved with, what is it called, agro? How many states have really done things that legitimize what they're doing? Like, have they passed laws or regulations that give them, that company and associates, more authority than would normally have been given if the state was allowed to do what they wanted to do, but they're sort of forced by circumstance into legislating? I'm curious about that.
Okay. If I understand your question, you're asking about whether we've had a land redistribution process in Kenya. Is that the question?
Well, I can only speak. I guess I'll give you an example from my territory. So the government of Canada, which is, you know, the one that was created by the British Crown to come into our territories, what they're trying to is, when we talk about land disputes, what they try to say is that we will recognize your land rights if you allow the people that have our title that we gave them, if you legitimize that title. And we've always said no, because we cannot make something legitimate what started out is illegitimate. But I see what's going on. I think I see what's going on here, is that prior to the prior colonization of, like, Kenya and other countries of the British, is that they tried to legitimize the land holdings of non-Kenyan people, and then when they decolonized, or supposedly decolonized, they ingrained in that system into the new regime, which then allowed these companies a foothold into the country using that system that they put in place before. That's what I'm seeing. But what I'm concerned about is how many state governments have then taken the next step, which legitimizes that system and give the companies more authority than they should probably have. That's what I'm.
Okay. So Kenya, as has been explained, Kenya was a settler colony. And if you know a little bit about the history of Africa, Kenya, Malawi, Zambia, South Africa, Zimbabwe were settler colonies. And countries that were settler colonies have very particular, settler colonization is very, very particular. And the countries continue to have serious questions around land. In Kenya, for example, as I said earlier, every single election, there's always tension because of the land question that plays out in very particular ways, and because it's become particularly ethnicized over time. So we never had a proper land distribution process. We have squatters, what the state called squatters, across vast sectors, vast areas across the country. But it's important to sit with the fact that with colonization came the idea of private property, right? The idea of title deeds. What was commons land before was transformed to private property, one of the crown, of settlers, and then after independence, a local elite, which continues to hold a vast majority of the land we have in Kenya, but we also have remnants of settlers, especially in areas like Laikipia, where the land of the indigenous Maasai people has been taken for climate change purposes, conservation projects, carbon market projects, the false solutions that we talk about, but they're going to say that they're solving the climate crisis by evicting hundreds of thousands of pastoralists from their land. So the idea around private property rights has continued, unabated, sustained, reinforced by narratives ideologically, as I was talking about, but also sustained by laws and regulations. We have a very transformative constitution in the country at present, but even within that transformative constitution, and also a Community Lands Act that was supposed to address the issues, especially of indigenous peoples in Kenya, still views, or rather opens up space for private property ideas. And of course, when you have not just corporations, not just entities like AGRA, but also the fact that countries are forced to change their legislation by the World Bank, for example, the IMF. The World Bank has doing something that they call doing business rankings, where countries are ranked in the context of how favorable are they to business, right? And because many countries want to open up, the idea is you open up your country for multinational corporations, then the idea is to pass legislation to make it easier for private companies from the global north, and of course increasingly from the east, right, from the Middle East and whatnot, to be able to gain a foothold in the country in terms of getting land, hundreds, in fact, millions of hectares across Eastern, the Horn of Africa, Sudan, Ethiopia, has been taken in the last 20 years for plantation farming by Saudi Arabia, Dubai, to corporations in the global north. So the idea of private property rights, the idea of monoculture plantation continues to persist. We link it from the colonial period when we think about Bengal to the present moment. It's an unbroken chain. It transforms because capitalism is a system that is able to not just live through crisis, but anticipate crisis. But the governing idea is that we must accumulate. So that continues unabated over time.
We'll now move to questions by you, members of the public jury. If you have a question, please limit it to 1 minute. Raise your hand, and presiding judge Radha Souza will call on the questions.
Okay, let's start from that end. Yeah, yeah.
Sure. Thank you so much. That was incredibly informative and insightful. I wanted to begin also with just a short reflection to one of the questions that were asked earlier about what can we do. So we in the UK have soaring levels of food bank usage. 50% of our food is imported. That means that we are in an area of food insecurity. So something that's very important for us is to just start growing, and that's something that will enable us to divorce ourselves from these corporations and systems of oppression, and allow us to act in solidarity with people in the Global South. And I think people in the Global South are beacons of knowledge for our organizing here as well, and that should be a two-way street. My question is a bit removed from that. It's around carbon markets and whether you think carbon markets can be transformed into channels for reparations. I know that they fall short very much with how they are now, but do you see them as potentially being transformed to something a bit more positive?
Do I take your answer?
Yes, yes.
Okay. No. And that is the politest answer I could give, because as we speak right now, and I know she's part of that. I'm part of the No Red in Africa network, and for the last 10 years, we have been documenting the death, evictions, and dispossession of people across Africa because of carbon market projects, and specifically forest-related carbon markets. The climate crisis is caused by capitalism. It cannot be solved by capitalism. We cannot see that intellectual ground. Even just at that level, we cannot. There are more transformative ways of dealing with the climate crisis historically and at present and contemporary, and we have heard around agroecology, for example, but we cannot. It's basically opening up the space for corporations, royal houses across the Middle East to get land, but also to evict the people of Africa. Surely we deserve better. Thank you.
Okay, we'll take one from here and then there. Yeah, here.
Thank you. I wanted to ask that just because we are talking about climate crisis or global crisis, every land some or the other way has been colonized. And you talked about legislation, you talked about vocabulary. So is there a way where we can change the vocabulary of the legislation and not, I mean, we have colonization, we have decolonization, and we have all the aspects and the effects and cause and effects. But can we move forward to change the vocabulary of how our legislation or how our policies being maintained or trained? Can we think of that? I mean, is it viable or is it possible?
Okay. So my answer to that is that, one, when I speak about vocabulary, it really is for me more in terms of speaking to movement spaces around, demanding the impossible. Because as I said, it feels like we have gotten to a space where more radical political demands have given way to very narrow ideas of rights and liberties and justice, a very depoliticized social justice language that doesn't really understand the moment and the historical configurations of multiple and intersecting crises. But when it comes to legislation at the national level, for example, I'll say that laws and regulations, basically law is a tool. It's a function. Law can be transformative. It can be liberatory, right? It can serve the people. But unfortunately, historically, because of class and class struggles, the law and regulations have come to serve the elite. So I say that it's not simply about tweaking it to having this beautiful law, but it must emerge out of popular struggles and popular movements, where the legislation anticipates and understands basically the world. And I'll give you a very quick example. In Kenya, we have an agroecology. It's a plan that's supposed to move into becoming an act, which is a really big deal. But when you look at the agroecology plan, it still has provisions for the criminal. It still says that even indigenous seeds must be registered, which completely goes against the ideas of liberation. So it's not just about changing vocabulary and imaginaries, but who does it serve? Does it serve peasant farmers? Does it transform? Does it change questions around who owns land? Who owns seeds? So it's much more, you have to conceptualize issues around the law in the context of the structural questions, not simply having an agroecology act that still does what the other side of legislation does. Yeah.
Thank you. There and then there. Yeah.
Thank you very much. My question is around the tension between the short term and the long term, between science and economics. Okay. And the context for the question is one where quite a number of the world's largest landowners and food growing corporations are realizing and developing sufficient scientific-based evidence to change intensive industrial agriculture and recategorizing hundreds of thousands of acres of their land towards more regenerative agroecological farming practices. So the question here in this context is there any space within the structures, the mechanisms that are allowing this kind of capturist capitalism? Is there any space within the organizations who grant these licenses and mechanisms and permit this to happen to provide evidence that what works in the short term is not working in the long term and needs to change from an ecological as well as an environmental and an economical point of view?
Okay. So I'll answer that with a question again, not just about, I think I spoke a little bit about cooptation. About a decade ago, AGRA used to accuse very many movements in Africa of romanticizing the peasants. Now, they use the word peasants and they talk about agroecology in their documents, but not agroecology not in the context of which we talk about. We must remember that our politics, one of the things that sort of also just links the long histories and conversations, whether we're talking about colonial Bengal and we're talking about 21st century in Africa, agroecology is also a political project. It isn't simply about a technically different way of doing farming. When we talk about the food sovereignty movement, there are demands around land redistribution. There are demands to transform trade, because trade as it sits is still colonial in nature. As I said, that the bilateral trade, for example, between the UK and African and Caribbean countries makes particular demands on its former colonies. So again, and linking it with the question that was just asked before, what is the political project, right? What is the liberatory project around that? And again, going back to the conversation around, can carbon markets be transformative? But can they be transformative in the context in which indigenous peoples who are evicted from their land during the colonial encounter still do not have access to their land in the 21st century, yet their land has been taken to solve the climate crisis. So these political questions and demands, and constantly centering the aspirations of those on the front lines of whether it's the climate crisis, whether it's the land crisis across time, has to be front and center. That is the political question. That is ultimately the question, not some fancy idea around whether agroecology is being done by which corporation, but does it transform society? That is the most important question.
Thank you. Yes, at that end there.
Brilliant presentation. I'd like to actually just think a little bit about resistant aesthetics and the history of kind of formations of anti-colonial or world-making projects that happened in Bengal and across the continent of Africa. One person is Rabindranath Tagore, who, created an art school in the early 1900s, late 1800s, and actually was a Pan-Asianist who traveled, all over the world, talking about many, many different things, singing the songs of the Himalayas, and then the school as well was some, I mean, he was a kind of pious, wistful character, but he still created quite an incredible school, an art school called Shantiniketan and Sriniketan, which children were put in relation to their land, to the land in different ways. He's a long story, but I think also it's important to think about Pan-Africanism. In relation to figures like Nkrumah, Marcus Garvey, in relation to the histories of negritude, in relation to thinking about Pan-Africanism, the borderless imagination, and transnationalism not as a project to kind of, extract from the state and destroy the state, but transnationalism as a way to create a symbiosis between the national and the international and the non-national and the post-state and the pre-state. So, because the liberation of the continent of Africa necessitates the liberation of every other part of the world.
Yeah.
So I'm interested in your reflections on Pan-Africanism.
Okay. I mean, and this city, London, is very central to Pan-Africanism and the Pan-African conference, 1945. I mean, one of the saddest things about, and I keep talking about, for example, Agra as a Pan-African project, not in the idea, the liberatory idea of Pan-Africanism, but it is a Pan-African project in the context in which it can influence the agricultural project or ideas of the African Union in 2025. And I was thinking actually a few hours ago when I was sitting there during the morning session that if Nkrumah or Cabral resurrected, they'd probably be like, I'd rather be dead than see what the continent, the liberatory ideas of Pan-Africanism has been lost. Again, going back to the question around what is a political project? Tricontinentalism is dead. The ideas around Bandung. Again, speaking about the Green Revolution, which was a counter to that radical idea, not just about Pan-Africanism, but the idea of the liberation of people who were colonized or had been colonized. So I guess that goes back to, I mean, it's a difficult question, I must say, and especially sitting in this particular world where I see almost complete hegemony in the context of what agriculture should be or how people should feed themselves. But it goes back to the kinds of political questions that we ask. It goes back to the ideas of freedom, the ideas of liberation, the historical memory. There's so many people on the continent who don't know the history of Pan-Africanism. When my own president calls himself a Pan-Africanist, yet calls for a climate summit in which McKinsey literally writes the outcome document, it becomes something totally different. But I think for me, it's not Pan-Africanism. Politics of struggle, politics of vocabulary, radical imaginaries. Unfortunately, we also sit in a space in which the NGOization of movement work, which again, I go back to what are the political demands? The political demands cannot simply be held in a very limited and narrow and liberal framework of justice. It has gotten us to fascism, where we are in 2025. So the political demands have to change. The radical cross-movement, transnational, not transnational states in the service of capital, but Pan-African ideas, but cross-continental, tricontinental, five-continental, whichever it is, ideas of liberation must be brought back to the conversation. It's not going to be brought back by NGOized politics. It's not going to be brought back by those of us who sit in academia one way or the other and are afraid to speak out truth to power. It is often the movements in Africa, for example, whether it's Abalali Basemjondolo in South Africa that literally occupies land and reclaims the radical ideas in South Africa, whether it is the movements, women across Africa, Seed Bank, Southern African Rural Women's Assembly, warming, so many eco-feminist collectives on the continent of Africa, reimagining our politics of freedom. That is where we get back that. But ultimately, as a final thing, we must reimagine the state. The right corporations have captured the state. And the response for us is not to step back into our enclaves and say that we'll just fight. We must fight for the state because we see with Agra, the state becomes a vehicle for either the elite and corporations, or we can fight to reclaim and reimagine the state where it becomes a vehicle for the liberation of the majority in society. Thank you. I think that was the last question. Oh, I'm good.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
This ends question.
Okay, it's decision time now. And before you make your decision on the basis of the evidence that you have heard now, I just want to bring your attention back into focus and to center it around the questions that we need to decide. I will just throw out some key issues on which we have heard evidence from everyone, the two witnesses and the advocate for this court. One was around finance. And what is finance? And finance is a legal construct which permits or allows the use of money as a medium of exchange. Yeah, that is, in a sense, the basics of finance. So how does this finance then become this big tool of colonizing? We heard about the EIC and how indigo planters came and invested money in that, and likewise, we heard about Agra. So just think about that. And also a lot was said about property rights and land as private property by both the witnesses and the advocate. Property is also a legal construct because there were societies that did not have private property. And what makes a transition is that little piece of paper that we call title, which has your name on it. Yeah? That the land remains the same. It's the piece of paper associated with the land that changes. So please think about the consequences of that based on the evidence that you have heard across time. There's a very fundamental question that came to my mind, which I will share with all of you. And that is the purpose of economic activity of any kind, since times immemorial, is to produce goods and services to satisfy human needs. Yeah, this is why, whether it is food or clothing or housing or whatever it is, tools, etc. But now we have heard the witnesses talk about legal entities like the corporations and states for whom production of goods and services is for money, money for money's sake. Yeah? Now, that seems to be a very fundamental tension between natural persons who undertake economic activity and a legal person who undertakes economic activity. So please take that into consideration when you make your decision. The witness who spoke for Agra, who spoke against Agra, also talked about intellectual property. And so did the advocate refer to intellectual property in relation to agriculture. To the best of my knowledge, intellectual property is when there is a completely new innovation that somebody claims, I have innovated this. But in agriculture, whose original innovation is intellectual property? Who invented agriculture? And who can claim that this agricultural practice is solely my creation that came out of my mind? Especially a corporation, if it has a mind at all. So think of that. And my last question that I want to draw your attention to is this. We are here to think about and to decide on climate crimes. And climate crimes, we have already looked at the act, and we understand, in this court, we understand climate crimes as crimes against ecologies and communities. So when we think about climate crimes on this scale that we have heard about from all the three presenters today, would it be possible for these crimes to be committed on this scale around the world for such a long time without the legal fiat of legal personalities? Yeah, legal personality for states and corporations that conceals and protects the real persons who are behind what is called the corporate veil. So if this legal personality or legal fiction did not exist, would crimes on this scale and for this length of time even be possible? So I'll just stop with that, bring your attention to these very basic issues, and then we can proceed further. Do you want to add anything?
We are extending a little bit, but I'll try to be short. Anyway, all what we have said this afternoon, it's really very important. What Radha just said is really extremely important to understand, to have a context of all what our guests, our witnesses, and the prosecutor have been saying, you know? Because it is important to understand what we are talking about. We are not talking about only of a project around, let's say, Bill Gates or the East India Company. It's wider, no? It's the way in which capitalism, with all the colonial powers behind it, has been working into a war of subsistence to force people all over to work for them in the harshest way possible, because that is in the interest of all the money makers. And there are four ways. I will try to summarize them as much as possible of this thing happening, no? Because there's the tearing apart of people, of communities from their territory. They pull them apart so they cannot have their way, no? And they disable people from their skills, strategies, and knowledge, no? By which people solve by their own means what matter most to them. And they even build distrust on their own methods. And that is Agra, the Green Revolution first, and then Agra. No? They say their methods are bullshit, and they say their methods are old, they are traditional, they're whatever. And suddenly they try to impose new ways, no? Agrochemicals, new seeds. Your seeds doesn't work, they say. Your seed don't work, sorry. And so other things they say to people, so they try to convince them and normalize the situation where they cannot solve what they solved before by their own means. Now they say you have to trust the big corporations, you have to trust the big landlords, we are going to solve all food for you and all that, no? And of course, one thing that is really very important to what we've been talking is that the climate crime, it's also that all this kind of agriculture transform the landscape in a very radical way, no? So everything below and above the ground, as it has been said in the Discord, through destruction and devastation, it transformed the land so much as we can say it's geo-engineered, no? So it is a way where the devastation is a way of acquiring more money and dispossessing people in all the ways possible, and the people cannot defend themselves. And finally, this is imposing a system of scarcity and even famine, you say, famine, to force them to work in whatever conditions the powerful want. No? One of them is, of course, and with that I end, this intellectual property scheme that tries to sell us the idea that because they found a seed and they do something around the seed, although we all know that the seed every time you plant it, it changes, no, from the ancient times, and many generations have contributed to that diversity and strength in the seeds. Now they say that they can claim that they are the inventors or the discoverers of that seed, and they claim they have an intellectual property right. Camila Montesinos, one agronomist she's very keen on these things. She said once that it's like claiming to be the owner of the house because you paint it, no? And the house has been built for centuries and centuries. No? We need to consider all these things so we can really understand and encompass what has been said today. Thank you for the time.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentations this afternoon. I just want to add a couple of things. I'm really grateful for where I live on Great Turtle Island. Some people call it America, but we call it Great Turtle Island. They tried to introduce the indigo plant first in Jamestown on the east coast of now, I guess it's Virginia. I'm not sure what state it is, and then they also tried to do it in New York, but it didn't grow. They couldn't make it grow. So we didn't have the imposition of indigo in our territory, which we're eternally grateful. But we did have a company that was based on the model of the East India Company. It was called the Hudson's Bay Company, which unbelievably this past 10 days has filed for bankruptcy and is completely falling apart. But they were only interested in furs. They weren't interested in, well, they can't grow really that much in our territory anyway because there's too much snow, there's too much winter, and not only that, but they didn't like the delicacy that we like, moose nose. And they weren't interested in our moose nose, so we didn't have to worry about that, our food supply. But I think the thing about what happened for our presentations today was that you heard how one company was created in order to minimize the risk to the crown and in the investment of them going out and exploiting other people. And now you see that one company that started in 1600 and it was in India and other parts of Asia, how that company model, as the model of the company, of investors and shareholders and that sort of thing, has now morphed into a multi-state operation that's doing the same kinds of things, but on a much larger scale. And they're not accountable even to the states that they're operating within. So I think today you saw the whole panorama from 1600 to 2025 and how these corporations have managed to protect themselves while exploiting the land. And I think that's what I've seen this afternoon listening to the presentations, and I thank the presenters very much for those contributions. So, hi, thank you.
That means we now move to the final part of procedures, and that is the verdict by you, the public jury. The special court, this special court for intergenerational climate crimes, puts before you 3 questions today that you can either vote agree for, that is 1 round, and 1 round for disagree. So I now call on public jury members to vote on the first question put to you by this court, and I will read it out twice. The first question is, do you agree that the British East India Company started the system of monoculture by forcing peasants to grow indigo as commercial crop, thereby creating food insecurity for people, deforestation, and loss of ecological diversity? So I repeat the question. Do you agree that the British East India Company started the system of monoculture by forcing peasants to grow indigo as commercial crop, thereby creating food insecurity for people, deforestation, and loss of ecological diversity? Those who agree, please raise your hands and hold them up for the vote count. Okay. Those who disagree, please raise your hands. I now call on public jury members to vote on the second question put to you by this court. The second question is as following. Do you agree that the systems of commercialization of agriculture and cultivation of cash crops for trade established by the East India Company in South Asia was replicated by the British Crown in its African colonies? So the question is, do you agree that the systems of commercialization of agriculture and cultivation of cash crops for trade established by the East India Company in South Asia was replicated by the British Crown in its African colonies? Those who agree, please raise your hands and hold your hands up for the vote count. Thank you. Those who disagree, please raise your hand. The third and final question put to you by this court as jury members is as following. Do you agree that transnational corporations and syndicates of wealthy states further expanded and embedded commercialization of agriculture that has increased food insecurity, deforestation, and loss of ecological diversity in Asia and Africa? The question is, do you agree that transnational corporations and syndicates of wealthy states further expanded and embedded commercialization of agriculture that has increased food insecurity, deforestation, and loss of ecological diversity in Asia and Africa? Those who agree, please raise your hand and hold your hand for the vote count. Thank you. Those who disagree, please hold your hand. So I have counted several absentee votes who voted neither for agree or disagree.
Thank you very much, members of the jury, for your participation, for contributing to the decision in these proceedings. Thank you to the witnesses. Thank you to the advocate and my fellow judges for all your contributions today. In case you have not noticed, our comrade Indigo appears to be very happy. The seeds are bursting, and I can see green shoots coming out of here. And we hope that those green shoots will come out of all of you in this room, in the outside world. Thank you very much.
This concludes today's session. All video proceedings will be released within the month, and the court aims to publish the full verdict in due course. And this court reconvenes tomorrow for the third hearing, Trading with People's Lives, the East India Company, the British Crown, and the violent severance of land-people relationships at 1 o'clock.